Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Ansel. I'm Vice President of Therapeutic Strategy here at Worldwide Clinical Trials. We are a company, as the name suggests, devoted to running clinical trials on behalf of pharmaceutical companies and biotechnology partners with a specific focus within rare disease. The exciting opportunity to answer some pressing questions that you might have around some aspects of clinical trials, including how are patients identified and recruited for these studies, what is inclusion and exclusion criteria, and how does that information impact the patients that are participating in our studies? Once you enroll in a study, what should you expect? And then what are some common concerns and misconceptions that we hear when participants enroll in the studies that we support for our pharma companies? First and foremost, how do we find our participants? And I really think there's two important buckets. One is either direct-to-patient methods or, quite inversely, patient-directed methods. If we think about the first bucket here, I think about a physician or a healthcare specialist speaking with a potential participant around how they can enroll in a clinical trial or have an opportunity to enroll in a clinical trial because they know that participant the best. They are ultimately providing the care for that participant. So it makes sense that a lot of physicians do enroll a number of participants on clinical trials. There's also a variety of advertisements. You might have heard these on the radio or in certain newsletters or in certain social media outlets of advertising potential interest in a clinical trial. Some of these advertisements are supported by vast recruitment campaigns using, again, social media, search engine optimization. As you search certain key terms into Google, you might see an ad for a clinical trial, and that's coming from a larger recruitment campaign. You might undergo genetic testing, and these genetic testing companies can match participants based upon certain criteria in their database around a potential clinical trial. So you might hear from either your physician or a laboratory, for example, around potential opportunity for enrolling in a clinical trial. Advocacy organizations, if you sign up for a newsletter or you are enrolled in a registry in a particular disease state, you might receive emails or phone calls as new clinical trials become available, alerting you about this potential opportunity. So there's many more other ways that I think direct-to-patient methodologies are applicable here, but you can kind of understand how there might be materials out there, whether they're from your physician or from this various campaigns that might alert you around a potential clinical trial. The other bucket is patient-directed. So you might yourself be looking for a potential clinical trial. And you can do this through various databases, such as clinicaltrials.gov or UDRACT-CT, is the ability to kind of Google or search into these databases for potential clinical trials that might be open for enrollment in or around where you live. Anecdote.me is another URL you can go to. It's a more user-friendly application of clinicaltrials.gov, allowing you to enter in your zip code and potentially some medical history information that will align you up with or match you with certain clinical trials. And again, advocacy organizations might have a listing. If there's a particular disease community, if they are have a focus within research initiatives, might have a listing of certain clinical trials that their participants or their advocacy community members might have access to. Again, this is not exhaustive. You could probably think of other avenues to find these clinical trials, but I really feel that there are two main buckets: direct to patient or patient directed. So once we find the patients, how do we determine their eligibility? Are you yourself eligible for a clinical trial? And you might have heard these terms before: inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this is the industry's way of measuring who is eligible for a study versus who isn't eligible for a study. So typically in the context of a clinical trial, if you are eligible for a study, a participant must meet all of the inclusion criteria, but they cannot meet any of the exclusion criteria. It's a lot of lingo, but I hope the next kind of example below really illustrates why this is important. The entire point of a clinical trial is to measure meaningful change of a therapeutic, a drug, an intervention. The goal is to select a patient population that is very similar. You can probably think of various indications or diseases your family members might have, and they might have very different features of that disease, or they might have very similar features of that disease. And if we think about what a clinical trial is trying to show, a meaningful change based upon a therapy or an intervention, it's very easy to do that when your patient population, or I should say it's easier to do that if your patient population is very similar. And that can be in terms of demographics or the stage of disease that an individual might have, the medical history, the medication use, or even a genetic subtype. So we use all these parameters, and again, we call them inclusion and exclusion criteria, to create a patient population that is very similar. And again, it's because it's often easier to find if there is a change from a therapy because that patient population is very similar versus having a very different patient population can be very challenging to find or measure changes if that population is very different from one another. So you found a clinical trial, you meet all of the inclusion, you meet none of the exclusion. What should you expect when you enroll in a clinical trial? And there's a couple of buckets here that are pretty similar. Not every study is the same, so you may or may not see these in every single clinical trial. But typically, a clinical trial has a period of screening. This period is focused on procedures to confirm eligibility. So they're confirming, does this participant meet all of the inclusion criteria, and do they meet none of the exclusion criteria? This typically lasts a couple of weeks. We wait. Typically, there's some labs that are drawn, some blood samples that are taken, and sometimes the analysis of those samples can take some time. So typically, the screening period is around a couple of weeks to maybe 4 weeks to even over a month. If you are eligible for the study, as found by the screening period, you might be entering a randomization period or the treatment period, where you are taking a therapy, a drug, or an intervention. And the whole point of this phase of the study is to determine, is that intervention working? Is it safe? Is it effective? And again, depending upon the type of study you're looking at, this treatment period can last several months to up to a year or even over a year. And typically, not every clinical trial, there might be a follow-up period. And the goal of the follow-up period is to assess any long-term safety or effectiveness features of that therapy after the treatment has been paused or continued. And similar to the treatment period, the follow-up period duration, dependent upon your own study, could be up to a year or even a few months, or might not even have a follow-up period. All of this information, all of the expectations, procedures, all of your rights, potential benefits, potential drawbacks of a clinical trial are all documented and discussed in the informed consent form. And this process happens before screening. So you learn all about what's required of you, what's the duration, and what are the expectations of you as a participant, even before you start to screen for that particular study. If you have any questions about these different buckets or these different periods, again, you would have this conversation with your physician or other healthcare professional that's talking to you about the potential clinical trial. We often hear at Worldwide some common concerns and misconceptions around participation for a clinical trial, and we hope to debunk some of them today, but also to shed some light on what we most commonly hear across various communities. One, we hear that, patients are very concerned around clinical trials being very dangerous. There are a number of checks and balances, reviews and committees, even before the first patient is enrolled on a clinical trial. There's various layers showing that documentation and that assessment of risk and assessment of potential benefit, again, even before a participant ever enrolls. If you are presented with a clinical trial and you still feel this level of safety, is this going to be helpful or harmful in any way, This will be discussed again during the informed consent process. Some participants are very concerned about receiving placebo. Even if a clinical trial does have a placebo, often called a sugar pill, again, the goal is to measure, is there meaningful change in a cohort of participants receiving a therapy or a cohort of participants who are not receiving therapy. And typically those in that latter cohort typically receive a sugar pill or a placebo. It often does not remove their ability to still receive standard of care. So again, this might differ depending upon which clinical trial you yourself are looking to enroll in, but it is something that will be listed out in your informed consent form, and it is something your physician will discuss with you. But just because a placebo is given to you does not mean you have to waive all elements of standard of care. And that will, again, be discussed with you during the informed consent process. There's this feeling of being treated like a guinea pig or a lab rat. And again, all within clinical research community, physicians and doctors treat all participants with the utmost respect, recognizing that you yourself are giving your time, energy, time left from work or school to participate in a clinical trial. So again, if you have concerns around being treated like a lab rat, we encourage you to speak to your physician, but all of the safeguards, checks and balances are discussed with you before you ever enroll in a clinical trial. And once you enroll in a clinical trial, your participation is completely voluntary. So sometimes there's this feeling I can't leave the study if I enroll on if I sign the consent form or I enroll in a clinical trial. And your participation is completely voluntary. You can quit or withdraw at any point during the study, and you would still receive the same care you otherwise would if you didn't enroll in the study. So again, something to discuss with your physician if this is a major concern for you. And lastly, we often hear that a clinical trial is a last resort. And in some instances, it can be, but often in other instances, it's the opportunity to enroll or take or use therapies that are often very novel and cutting edge. But again, these therapies are often investigational. So if there is a concern around any of these misconceptions, we do encourage you to speak with your healthcare professional or physician before enrolling. If you have any questions, there is a fantastic organization called CISCRP, CISCRP, and that stands for Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. This is an organization that's solely focused on providing education and information for study research participants. They have frequently asked questions, brochures, and infographics. They even have a PDF for you to ask your physicians a list of these questions before you even participate in a clinical trial. So I highly encourage, if I was not able to answer a question you had, I encourage you to go to ciscript.org to learn more or to find additional information that might be able to answer your questions. So with that, I hope I was able to provide more information of an overview of clinical trials, address your concerns, misconceptions, how we find participants, and what are the overall expectations once you enroll in a clinical trial. If you have any questions, I encourage you to listen to the rest of the webinars, the other panelists, and the other video recordings, as your questions might be answered there. Thank you so much.